What's this? What's this? And what is one of these? What's this? This is not going to be a musical video. We just have to set the tone at slightly silly for this one. The rules have changed and the items you get in the 10th edition starter box set are not what they once were for previous starter sets. I'll be looking over the nostalgic items of the past and you can decide for each of these if their absence is a good thing or if it's a mistake on the part of Games Workshop. The red rulers. These are for measuring, but their main use was for whipping people. Also, they tended to snap at exactly the halfway point, so if you ever need to measure 9 inches away for something like Deep Strike in the modern day, these 18-inch rulers are great. Now we just get these safe, bendy plastic versions. I would say children are missing out, but children with rulers are stupid. Children just do not understand the difference between shatterproof, shatter-resistant, and it is not possible to snap this ruler. So they all just ended up snapped. And they were like, Miss, it didn't do the thing. It said it wouldn't shatter and I did it. And the teacher would just be like, that's not science. You didn't just do science. The problem with the red rulers is that the numbers were really hard to read, so you couldn't actually see if your opponent was really moving only 6 inches or if it was like 7 inches. And they had a pointy end, so you could stab with them as well as whip people. 18 inches was not a great length, it's too long to conveniently fit on a table, and if you're measuring 24 inches away, such as for the average bolt gun, measuring 18 inches meant you had to put the ruler down, then make a point, and then move an extra 6 inches to see if you're in range. It was a pain. I switched to tape measures pretty quickly. Flamer templates. Ah, the flamer templates through the ages. You see, flamers used to be able to hit multiple models. In 2nd edition, the template you would put over them was colourful, but you couldn't see through it. The later editions had clear plastic. 3rd edition was the best one because it was orange and matched the colour of fire, while also being quite see-through. It had a plastiglass feel and a bit of weight to it. We can talk about the other circles in a minute. The 4th edition starter set had white plastic, which again, pretty clear to see through, and then they moved on to this green colour, which just isn't the colour of fire. Fire has never got so hot that it turns green. That's some alien stuff right there. Between 3rd and 5th edition, there was no Overwatch, so templates were good and you didn't need to worry about how you figure them out in Overwatch. 2nd edition's Overwatch was more like a delayed shooting phase until the enemy is moved, a bit like how it's worked in 10th edition, but we'll not get into the detailed comparisons. 6th and 7th edition still had the flamer template, but you had a different rule called Wall of Death, where you got a certain number of auto hits against a charging enemy, regardless of the distance. The template itself was a 7-inch cone, but now pretty much all flamer weapons are 12 inches in range. In 2nd edition, you also had the twin flame template for the Immolator, because of how awesome and special that battle sister tank was. But the hand flamers that the Seraphim had were a mere 3 inches. I would say you should choose the Inferno pistols, but for 2nd edition sisters, there were no Inferno pistols. Firing a flamer and putting a template out makes it feel like a totally different weapon. And because of how it worked, where you put it over models, it actually did much more against hordes than single models. And if you clump them up into a corridor or an alleyway, now you're thinking with extra tactics. In 10th edition, you roll a dice to see how many hits you get, which means you can get multiple hits on the same model, and that just seems kind of odd. When you were firing the flamer, you had to make sure that the flame trooper was at the front, otherwise the template could hurt your own men. Most editions had the ability to shoot through models in your own unit, but not flamers. In 6th edition, people got upset at flamers because of how casualties work. Because you have your template, you have your flamer trooper in the front, so they died first. Casualties were removed from the closest to the enemy, so unless you surprised the enemy, you wouldn't usually get to fire your flamer. And when firing Overwatch, they auto-hit with some shots, even against individual models, and you took casualties from the closest to the enemy model, so Overwatch against a unit with flamers could mean you just fail the charge, even though you would have been in range if the flamer hadn't killed like that one guy in front. Another problem is with the number of hits, and that also happened with the round blast templates. For blast templates you had small and large, and some others. In most editions, you placed the blast template over the enemy and you rolled a scatter dice. This had 2 direct hits and 4 arrow directions, and you rolled a 2d6 with it to see how far it went in the direction that was pointed. If you rolled a hit, then it didn't matter about the d6s you rolled. Early barrage weapons were different, and you had to guess a range, and then roll a scatter dice after that. The third gun had a series of templates that scattered off one another in a direction, And then there was also the Apocalypse Blast templates, but only for the biggest of guns and monstrous foot stomps. The scatter dice could be a little bit of a problem, because if you didn't roll that dice close enough to the template, you could get some strange understandings of which direction something was moving in. The arrow might be pointing towards the right side of the battlefield, and then when you think about that, oh, is it? Because the dice is so far away from the template, you're trying to be like, it's here, and it was a faff. People's minds seem to boggle at the idea. But these are still used in Adeptus Titanicus. The good thing about blast weapons, it brought you more into the game. It felt like you were firing this really cool explosion weapon. Now you need to roll a high number for the number of shots, and hope that rolling lots of dice makes you feel the same way as putting a big blast template down on a horde. It just doesn't quite match the feeling. Really large hordes haven't been affected in the same way. In 9th edition, you had to figure out how many models were in a unit, and then based on that, you got a minimum number of shots. But the current blast, where you add an extra shot for every 5 models in the enemy unit, is mostly much easier to figure out. Because blast weapons were so random, orcs were just as good at firing blast weapons as any other factions. Doesn't matter if it's an orc lobber, space marine missile launcher, or imperial guard mortar. They all use blast weapons in the same way. You place it in range, you roll the scatter dice, and see what happens. In later editions, then the distance scattered was modified by ballistic skill. Ballistic skill 5, you moved it 2 inches back the way you wanted. Ballistic skill 4, you moved it 3 inches. More on the weird things about ballistic skill later. But modifying something by a ballistic skill was such a minor alteration, because remember, a third of the time, you'll just roll a hit. So orc blasts were typically just as good. You could also scatter things back onto yourself. So danger close firing really was danger close. And creeping bombardment tactics when you're going for an enemy trench, you've got to be figuring out when you're going to actually not fire that bombardment anymore, otherwise you're hitting your own guys who were about to charge bayonet first into the enemy trench. But there was so much of a bad side that came with the blast templates and the flame templates. Base sizes mattered a lot more then than it currently does. How scoring hits worked, you placed the template over the enemy unit, and for every model that was under that template, they could be hit. Some editions you needed to have the base wholly covered to get hit, otherwise the model was only hit on a 4+. Some editions, if even the tiniest part of a base was covered, they were hit. Fights would happen over how much of the model was actually covered, and in competitive games, arguments would ensue and organisers have to be called over. So a Space Marine squad with a flamer and a missile launcher, a pretty average squad in like 5th edition, under Matt Ward, that traditional pairing was a free weapon upgrade, while all the other special and heavy weapons cost points. Now they're all free anyway, but after fighting over where to place the flame template, you have to do the same again with the missile launcher, but then you also have to fight about the scatter dice result, and then you have to fight again over where the new placement of the blast marker is, and how many are hit, and oh look at that, someone just got stabbed with a red ruler. So unless you had a very accommodating opponent, it would take time to figure out. Even more if your gun fires a lot of blast weapons, each of which might scatter. So a unit like the Imperial Guard Wyvern, or a Devastator squad with all plasma cannons and missile launchers, would take a while. The way casualties were taken from blast templates also changed over the editions. In some editions, the unit got hit. In 6th edition, if you fired your barrage weapon and placed the blast template just right, you could target enemy characters even though they were meant to be safe within a unit. And things got more complicated in 7th edition with weapons that were massive, like the bigger Tyranid creatures and apocalypse-sized flame tanks. They could pick a point within 12 inches to start the template, not just placing it from the gun or from the base. Now, you can burn a unit behind another unit. And you could burn a unit if you could only see one model poking out of cover. All of them get covered by the flame template, but then, because of how line of sight rules worked in that edition, if the one visible model was taken off as a casualty, no one else died. So it was all rather confusing. Do you think it was better with the templates, or do you just like the missiles and the flamers to work the same as other guns? You roll some dice. Vehicles had some very interesting interaction with the blast templates, and this was all to do with armor facings. Armor facings were like a different toughness value on each side of the vehicle. So rather than having one toughness value like the vehicles do now, it was different at the front compared to the rear. Usually the front would be the toughest, the rear would be the weakest, and the sides would be somewhere in the middle or have the same toughness as the front. And it had a different way of figuring out how you do damage against it. With current toughness and past toughness, you roll a dice and there's a little table that tells you if you've wounded the enemy. With armor facings, it was a value you needed to equal or beat. and you added your strength plus a d6. So a strength 7 plasma gun against side armor 11, if you roll a 4 to wound, but it's not really to wound, then you've scored an 11, 7 plus 4, equal to the armor value, that is a glancing hit. If you rolled a 5 or a 6, then you have got higher than the armor value, and that is a penetrating hit. Each of those had different tables to see what happened. It made tanks feel much more present in the game. You could do things like flanking. You could do the Kelly's Hero thing where you get into their rear and shoot through the rear. And then you're going to penetrate the rear because you cannot penetrate the front. Deep strike mattered. The rules for most editions were that you could deep strike from any distance away, but you weren't allowed to charge. So once the Battle Sisters had Inferno pistols, you could drop your Seraphim squad 2.5 inches behind an enemy tank and melt a hole through it. You just had to be aware that deep strike was something else, like blast markers, that could scatter. So in some editions, if you were to deep strike into a tree, then you'd roll on a table to see how bad it was. Other editions, your Terminators just became kebab skewers, and if you rolled a double 1 for the amount you scattered, then your Terminator squad just didn't appear. Lost in the warp. So there was always a risk to putting things in deep strike. Not so much now, where it's just, oh, okay, I just need to be 9 inches away. No penalties, no scattering, no possibility of being lost. But the armor facings were good for the theme of fighting tanks with other anti-tank weapons and infantry. Now on vehicles like the Chimera, the Rhino, the Lehman Russ, it's all fine. You have a square, you have a clear center, and you can draw lines across in an X shape, and you can see where the front is, where the sides are, and if a model is in that arc or not. Now, trying it with a circle-shaped vehicle, when the cockpit isn't actually the center, and now you have the difficulty of using this rule on a more irregular shape, and it gets more and more difficult as the shapes change. So look at this Necron Doom Scythe. This is a vehicle. Where do you measure from as the center? Do you go from the cockpit? Or do you go from the center of mass, which is the gap in the middle, which doesn't actually have any part of the model in it? So I don't know if that's considered the center of the model when there isn't actually a bit of a model there. And then you got disparity between what is a vehicle and what is a monster. It wasn't just a keyword. A Carnifex and a Dreadnought are about the same size, but the Carnifex was a monster with a toughness value and an armor save, and instead the Dreadnought had an armor value. It was hard to balance the two against one another. An Eldar Wraithlord, previously called an Eldar Dreadnought, despite being a mechanical walker, is a monster, not a vehicle with armor facings. The Avatar was a monster, and that came initially on a square base. Now that should have been very easy to figure out armor facings, but it was a monster, so it didn't have them. Instead, in 2nd edition, it had rules that it was immune to fire, immune to melter, and because of its high toughness, it couldn't be hurt by toughness 4 weapons. Can you think of a faction that started in 2nd edition and uses a lot of flamers, melters, and strength 4 bolt guns? For the Sisters of Battle in 2nd edition, the only weapon in their entire arsenal that could hurt the Avatar was a sister on foot with a heavy bolter. 2nd edition really was just a wacky, unbalanced edition. The tanks also had their guns, and the guns had facings. And there were different rules for different weapons as to what is a turret, what is a coaxial weapon, what's a sponson, what's on a top thing that can just spin around. Each of them had to have their own rules and their facings as to what they could fire at. Currently in 10th edition, all of the guns can be fired from any part of the vehicle. You stick half a track out, the battle cannon can fire, the sponsons can fire, and the heavy bolter in the middle can fire. In the past, sponson weapons had an actual arc and a reason for being there. So the gun on the left can only fire to the left, the gun on the right can only fire to the right. Positioning your tank became much more important. If your tank was in the middle of the board, it could probably fire guns blazing at everything. If it was going up one flank, then one of its guns was probably not going to be able to fire unless there was an enemy directly in front of it. This is something I miss, because in 10th edition with firing everything from half a track, it really takes you out of the game. It doesn't feel like the battle is actually happening. A small card box with the word Lehman Russ written on it is functionally the same as the Lehman Russ model, and I don't think this is such a good change. But it's all being done in the name of simplifying the game. But by no means is the game ever simple. Then we have all of the tables. Currently there's just a couple, and you don't really get to roll on them. There's no like randomness and RNG, but it does have its upsides. The new wound table is much easier to figure out. If your strength is lower than the enemy toughness, you need a 5+. But if the enemy toughness is double your strength, you're going to need a 6+. Easy. That gets rid of the whole, I brought a Wraith Lord, so if you look at this strength toughness comparison chart, no model in your army except one can hurt anything of mine. Yes, Eldar have been hated across the editions for players like this. Wraith armies are a pain. Currently they're hard to wound, previously they were impossible to wound. Ballistic skill was a weird thing as well. I like that it now is, on your unit index card it says, this weapon hits if you roll a 3+. Everyone can understand that. Ballistic skill was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then in reverse, what you needed to roll to hit. So ballistic skill 1, you only hit on a 6. Ballistic skill 4, you hit on a 3. Ballistic skill 3, you only hit on a 4+. That was a weird thing just to make adding much easier, because when you think about it in the literal sense, 4+ plus 1 is 5+. But that makes your shooting worse, not better. So going from ballistic skill 4 to ballistic skill 5, you go from hitting on a 3 to hitting on a 2. That made more sense, but then you have a whole table of inverse the dice roll. So I think the new wound table and getting rid of the old ballistic skill table, yeah, we're improving there. But the vehicle damage table, when you would score those glancing or penetrating hits, you got a cool table, but it was very swingy. A tank with only one gun cared a lot about weapon destroyed, but artillery pieces wouldn't care if they got immobilized, but a combat dreadnought really did. Some editions it was really hard to hurt vehicles, even with weapons designed for it, because you could roll low and basically do nothing. Or in other editions, every roll on the table was awful, and a 5+ from some weapons could blow up anything. Replacing this whole table with a damage roll against a number of wounds gets rid of a lot of the random swinginess, unless you are playing Battle Sisters or Eldar with Miracle Dice and Fate Dice. And with damage rolls, after you've actually damaged a tank, you are at least doing some permanent injury, unless they have like grot riggers or the ability to heal their vehicles. And there's no, oh, you rolled really high all the way through, but actually at the end you did nothing, or you rolled pretty averagely and the whole tank blew up. But in past editions, everything had a table. Tables were fun. In 2nd edition, there was no consensus on what happened if you had to roll multiple times on a table. Does the attacker decide? Does the defender decide? Do both happen? In what order do they happen? Do you pick the highest roll? That isn't necessarily the best roll. And this is why 2nd edition often encouraged you to have a games master running everything. Later editions then sorted out things like the vehicle damage tables, and you just picked the highest. My favourite table of them all was Who Won Combat table in Warhammer Fantasy. So it didn't matter if I didn't kill anyone on the charge and you killed 5 of my people. I am in your flank. I have 3 ranks of my mates, Jimmy is waving the banner, and young Sal just put out a proper belter on the drums. You're the one that runs away. If you like tables in your games of Warhammer, make sure that you're subscribed. And moving more into Warhammer Fantasy, where it mainly existed, the artillery dice. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 misfire. It was basically a d6 that you double, and the 6 is a misfire. I have had players forget their dice and try and use absurd math so that 1 is the misfire, a 2 is a 2, 3 is a 4, 4 is a 6, 5 is an 8, and 6 is a 10, just so that big numbers mean better things. But because of its one very important side, it was often called the misfire dice instead of the artillery dice. After 2nd edition, it was mainly a Warhammer Fantasy thing. Other dice to go were like the sustained fire dice that made the assault cannon on the Terminator squad very, very scary, unless it jammed. But 2nd edition was using all kinds of dice. A heavy bolter used to do d4 damage, not 1 or 2. And other weapons used d8s and d10s. Armor saves were taken on 2d6. Having a 5+ save in 2nd edition meant something totally different to now. And this came from the D&D side, where those sorts of dice were expected among players due to the high overlap at that early time in the 90s. That, and in 2nd edition, it hadn't quite gotten over the idea that having a third player to act as a games master was an integral part. This was a game all about crafting fun. Now we have tournament style and competitive gaming as the norm in 40k. So in 10th edition, if you want to know the number of shots for an artillery piece, you roll 2d6. There's no risk of it breaking just from firing the gun, so things are less orky. Adding hazardous as a keyword just doesn't do it for me. Make them wacky powerful, but unreliable. It's hard to balance, but so is 40k anyway. Some players will like the certainty. They play Eldar for the Fate Dice and the rerolls. Some players like Random Madness Go, but Orcs have had far less Random Madness than before. They were an army that used to be able to turn up and say, I don't know what's going to happen, but it's going to be fun. And I'm a firm believer that 40k should be an enjoyable experience, something that is designed between two players to be a fun time for both of you. It is never going to be truly balanced, so it isn't great as a competitive sport that gets televised. So long as it's mostly fair, it is okay, and then you have to pick your opponent. And there's another point that I have, and it's something I'll come back to again in future videos, but I was reminded of it while I was playing Genestealer Cult against some other people at the start of 10th edition. There is a difference between a broken faction and a broken army. You can say, oh, the Genestealer Cult, they keep coming back again and again, and if they have loads of neophytes and loads of acolytes, they come back infinitely. The Jackal Bikers can do a horde of mortal wounds. Aberrants are impossible to kill. And they're saying all this, and looking at my army, I have 2 neophyte squads, a Ridge Runner, 1 squad of acolytes, a bunch of metamorphs, no bikes. But still the complaints come, including from people who have never played against Genestealer Cult before. We play the game for fun. So I didn't bring a super tuned, overpowered army to a casual game where I want to have fun with someone else. Still kept the aberrants though. Chunky boys with big hammer lady. Very fun. Now what can you use all of these things for? The scatter dice and the artillery dice can be put next to a unit to try and remember some effects. The misfire is a debuff, the hit indicator is a buff. The artillery dice could also be used to track wounds, but only if the number of wounds taken is an even number of wounds. The red sticks could be used to mark off deployment zones, assuming that the terrain is there to accommodate. Or you can just whip it at a bag of food and open it and everyone thinks that it's really cool. Or you could stop playing 40k, go over to Horus Heresy and Adeptus Titanicus and use those dice and rules and templates all over again. Did you like a look back at how things were in 40k? Then let's look at how Space Marines have changed. Or have they?